In this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can conduct scanning using a tool like Nessus. Now, as we go through this lesson, I'm going to be going through my own sample lab and be able to do some scans with Nessus across these different devices. I'm doing these both individually and as a group. Now, what you're seeing here on the screen is a visual representation of my current lab network. Over on the left side, you'll see that at IP address 192.168.1.116, that is a Mac machine. And that's actually my desktop that I'm using to record this video to demonstrate how to use Nessus. In addition to that, I also have a Kali Linux machine, which is what I'm logged into now as a virtual machine. All of the things that are starting with 192.168.150. something are part of my virtual network in the lab environment, whereas the Mac machine is part of my office network, which is why it has a different IP address starting with 192.168.1. something. Now, as you look at the circle, you will see that there are different devices that are connected to this virtual network, including a Windows 11 machine at 192.168.150.138, my local host, which is also my Kali Linux machine, which is 192.168.150.129, my Metasploitable 2 virtual machine that is going to be a very vulnerable client for us to find a lot of issues and vulnerabilities with, and that's at 192.168.150.136, and an Ubuntu Linux machine that is located at 192.168.150.137. Now, the Windows 11 machine, the Ubuntu machine, and the Kali Linux machine should all be relatively secure because they've just been installed and they've been updated with the latest security patches. The Metasploitable 2 machine, on the other hand, will probably find a lot of vulnerabilities because it is a vulnerable machine by default, and we use this to be able to practice our penetration testing skills or our cybersecurity analyst skills by finding those vulnerabilities and then trying to patch them, rescanning the machine, and then seeing if we've solved those vulnerabilities in the network. All right, now that we have a basic understanding of the network that we're going to be using, let's go ahead and move into looking at Nessus. All right, here you can see the Tenable website, and if you go to tenable.com, you can search for the Nessus Essentials tool. This is a free tool that used to be called Nessus Home, and it allows you to scan your environment, including all of your network, up to 16 IP addresses per scanner, using the same high-speed, in-depth assessments that you'd get with the professional version of Nessus. As a cybersecurity analyst, you need to get comfortable using vulnerability scanners like Nessus and OpenVAS, because depending on where you work, you'll either be using Nessus or OpenVAS or QualsGuard or some other vulnerability scanner, but most of them work pretty much the same way. So in this lesson, we're going to use Nessus Essentials because it is something that is free to use, and you can download it and do this on your own home network as well to see what vulnerabilities exist there. To do that, simply go to this web page, entering your first name, last name, and email address. They'll take you to the download page, and they'll email you an activation code with a license key that is good for about 5 years for you to be able to start playing with Nessus and getting used to how it works. Once you have Nessus installed on your computer, it's going to run as a program in the background and essentially starts up a web server that you can access on your local machine. To access this, you'll go to localhost 8834, which is port 8834 on your local host, which is the machine you're accessing it from. In my case, that's my Kali Linux machine. Once you're there, you're going to walk through the setup wizard and then you'll create an account. In my case, I've already done that, so I'm just going to go ahead and log in using my account, which is Dion Training. Once you've done that, you'll be brought into the My Scan screen. Now, the first time you do this, you're going to have nothing listed here because it is going to be a blank scan because you haven't done anything with Nessus yet because it's a brand new install. In my case, I've already done a couple of these scans for us, so that way we'll be able to look at the results without having to wait a long time for them to come back from doing the scans. These scans can take a really long time depending on the size of your network. Even for a really small lab environment like the one I have that top scan, which is a basic scan of my entire network, that has been running for about 45 minutes at this point. Now, in order to use Nessus, you need to create a scan profile, and you can see I have several of them already created here. I'm going to walk you through how you can create your own scan profile, and then we'll take a look at some of the results from my scanning profiles that have already been run. To do this, simply click New Scan at the top right corner of your screen, and then from here, you'll see all the different types of scanners you have, including discovery scanners to be able to figure out what hosts are on the network, vulnerability scanners that will target specific vulnerabilities, or we also have compliance scans. Now, when you're using Nessus Essentials, compliance scans are not something you're going to be able to use. These compliance scans are things like PCI DSS internal network scans, or offline configuration audits, or the PCI quarterly external scans that are required once a quarter if your organization takes credit cards as part of their business model. All these are things that are included with the Nessus Professional and Expert versions, but in the Home version, which is Nessus Essentials, these are actually blocked out, and you have to pay to get access to those. For most of us, though, if we're doing this in our home network, those don't actually matter that much because you're probably not processing credit cards on your home computer, and instead you're more focused on the things that are above, which are the different vulnerabilities or the discovery scan. Now, if you're looking at these different vulnerabilities, you'll notice these are targeted for specific groups of vulnerabilities. For example, you can see in the middle of my screen there's one called the WannaCry ransomware. This was really popular back in 2017 and affected all Windows machines at the time. When something like that comes out, a lot of times Nessus will create a specific scan vulnerability for that one plugin. This way, you can quickly look across your entire network, even if you have 100 or 1,000 machines, and check just for that one vulnerability. That's the reason why you're seeing these vulnerabilities listed here, because these are the ones that were really, really important to look for. Things like Spectre and Meltdown and WannaCry and Ripple20 and things like that. So for our cases, we're not going to look at just a single vulnerability, but we want to look at what vulnerabilities exist across the entire network so we can get a better idea of exactly what vulnerabilities exist right now in our network and create a baseline for us to use as we move forward. To do this, we're going to do a basic scan. So I'm just going to click over here and do a basic network scan, which is a full system scan suitable for any host. And once I click on that, it's going to have me give it a name. In my case, I'm just going to call it network scan, and then I'm going to give it a description. Now, this is really helpful because these scans are ones that you're going to create and then use week after week and month after month. And so 6 months from now, you might forget, why did you call this network scan? So in my case, I'm going to say a lab demonstration of using Nessus as a vulnerability scanner. All right, and then we're going to save it into a folder. We can do it in the My Scans folder, which you see in the top left corner, or you have the All Scans folder. If I wanted to create a new folder, I can do that as well. But for our purposes, the My Scan folder is going to be just fine. And then we're going to list out our targets. Now, when you're listing out your targets, you can do this based on domain names like diontraining.com or by using IP addresses. For example, if you're doing your internal local network, you're probably going to have to use IP addresses because you probably don't have a domain name associated with each and every host on your network. Now, in my case, I'm using the 192.168.150.0/24 network. Now, if I didn't know any of my hosts on that network, I can scan the entire subnet of 256 hosts by using something like this. Now, instead of doing this though, if I know what my hosts are, I can list them out individually by putting in their IP addresses. So in my case, I do know all of my hosts, which is 192.168.150.136, which is my Kali Linux machine. Then I'll put comma, and I'll add the next one. I want to put my Windows machine, which is 192.168.150.138. I'll also want to include my Ubuntu machine, which is 192.168.150.137. And I also want to add my Metasploitable 2 machine, which is 192.168.150.139. And I can even add my Mac machine, which is 192.168.1.116. Now notice those first four are all going to be right next to each other. 136, 138, 137, and 139. So instead of writing it out that way, which takes a lot of time, I can actually just use a dash in between and do 136-139, and then I can get rid of all of the rest of those, and it will still scan all four of those hosts because I'm doing everything between 136 and 139, which includes 137 and 138. I would still need to have a comma here to separate that range from my Mac machine because my Mac machine is outside of that range and it's a separate subnet. Now, in this case, this would give me 5 different machines to scan, and I think that's fine. Another thing you can do is you can upload your targets by adding something like a CSV file. For example, you might have a CSV file with 1,000 clients spread across multiple subnets. Instead of typing them all in, you can just import that file by clicking Add File here. The next thing we're going to do is go down to our Schedule option. From Schedule, we can enable or disable this. Right now this is disabled, but I want to go ahead and enable this. Now by doing this, I can schedule scans and allow them to happen once a week, once a day, once a month, or once a year. For example, we mentioned the fact that there are these quarterly PCI DSS scans that we do all the time as cybersecurity analysts. You can set those up here and say once a quarter on the first of every third month, I want you to run a full PCI DSS quarterly scan and give me those results. So a lot of this can be automated and set up so you don't have to sit here waiting for these scans to complete. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and enable this, and we're going to say we want to do this as a frequency of weekly, and I want to do this every Saturday morning starting at 1 a.m. So I'll click on that, and the first Saturday we're going to come to is going to be January 14th of 2023. You'll then select the time zone associated with that, and for me that's going to be the East Coast, which is New York inside of the United States, and then I'll repeat this every week, and I can choose which day I want it to happen, And in my case, I want it to happen every Saturday. So I'm just going to go ahead and highlight the Saturdays there. And you can see the summary at the bottom. It repeats every week on Saturday at 1 a.m. starting Saturday, January 14th, 2023. And that's how you can set up a scheduled scan. The next thing we can do is go to our Notifications tab. Under Notifications, we can configure an SMTP server, and then we can send an email when our scans are complete. So after it scans this thing at 1 a.m. on Saturday, it can then email me a PDF report that says, here's all the vulnerabilities I found. And so again, this makes it a really nice automated process for us as cybersecurity analysts, and so it is something you might want to go ahead and set up. In addition to that, you can also use results filters, so you can say, hey, only email me if this happens, or don't email me when this happens. The next thing we're going to do is click on Discovery. Under Discovery, we're going to say what kind of types we want to use for our scans. Now, by default, the most common is going to be doing a port scan of the common ports. This is usually the 1,000 most commonly used ports, and this will be a much quicker way of doing a discovery scan, but you could miss some things. So personally, I like to do a more comprehensive scan, and I will do a scan of all ports on those machines, or if you're looking for a specific port only, like which ones are web servers, I can do that by doing a custom port. And in that case, I would just select custom, and then I would be able to choose my own discovery settings by doing the host discovery, port scanning, service discovery, or identity. And in this case, it'd be service discovery, that I would be looking for a particular type of web server, like an Apache web server over port 80 or port 443. So again, this just gives you additional areas. For our use case though, we're going to go ahead and stick with the all port scan, which will go ahead and scan all of the ports available, and it will use netstat if the credentials are provided, and it will use a SYN scanner if necessary, because sometimes ping scans won't work. The next thing we're going to look at is our assessment. Under assessment, we're also going to choose the scan type here. The default is going to be our most basic scan, and right now we're not even scanning for web application vulnerabilities. This is fine if we're going to be scanning a bunch of hosts that are on a network, such as people's workstations, because they shouldn't be running web applications on those. But if you're checking a web server, you would want to enable those web application scans. And in my case, one of my machines, the Metasploitable 2 machine, is running a web server. So I want to change that from default, and I want to go ahead and say scan for all web vulnerabilities complex. This is going to be our most thorough and in-depth scan. And again, there is an option to do a custom scan where you can set up all your different parameters. Next, we have our report. Under our report, we have the ability to set up different things, including the ability to designate hosts by their DNS name, be able to show all the hosts that responded to a ping, display any hosts that were unreachable. For example, you said you expected 100 machines to be online, but you only found 73. What were the other 27 machines that were offline? Well, if you display unreachable hosts there at the bottom, that will actually show that to you in your report. And so all of these things are things that you can configure for part of your reporting. Then we'll go into our Advanced tab, and again, here's another scan type. We're using the default right now, which is fine. If you're scanning over a low bandwidth link, such as a VPN or some kind of remote office connection, you may want to use that. Or again, you can use custom, where you can use more or less scanners each time. In my case, using the default, this says I'm going to be able to scan up to 30 hosts at one time. I can do 4 checks per host at one time, and I have a 5-second network readout timeout. If I wanted to increase that or decrease that, I could do that by using the custom area. The next tab we have is our credentials. Now, as you know, you can either use credentialed or uncredentialed scans. And if you're going to use credentialed scans, that means you're giving it the username and password for an account on that given system. If you're using a Windows machine that you're scanning, you'll simply click on Windows and then entering your username and password there and save that. And it'll allow Nessus to connect to that machine using those user credentials and be able to get a better idea of what vulnerabilities exist. I've already done a scan of doing both a credentialed and non-credentialed scan against my Windows 11 machine, and you'll see that when we did a credentialed scan, we actually found one additional vulnerability that wasn't found when we did an uncredentialed scan. So it's important to realize this and determine which type of scan you want to do. If you're trying to see what vulnerabilities exist for an outside attacker, then doing an uncredentialed scan would be the way to go. If you want to see what an insider threat could do who has a valid login and password, then using something like a credentialed scan would make sense. And the final tab we have is our plugins. Now, plugins inside of Nessus are used to be able to check for certain vulnerabilities. Here you can see the plugin families down the left and then the plugin names on the right. For example, if I go down here and I go all the way to the bottom, you will see that we have 3 different ones for Windows. The first one in the Windows family has a whole bunch of plugins, and you can see them listed on the right. For example, we could be checking to see if TeamViewer's insecure directory permissions privilege escalation is something our machine is vulnerable with. That's because we have that plugin there, 135708, and it will check that when we're doing our scans. Right now, all of these plugins are enabled, and we're going to be using all of them when we do our scan, but we could check for just a single vulnerability as well. Essentially, if there is a vulnerability out there that's known, Nessus will go ahead and make a new plugin and release that to the client. Speaking of that, how do you update your scanner to ensure you have all the latest plugins? Well, the best way to do that is by clicking on the Settings tab at the top, but we'll do that after we finish creating our scan. Now that we've looked at all the plugins we want, we can go ahead and hit Save, and that will save that for us. And then from here, it's asking us for the credentials for our Windows machine. In our case, we don't want to use that, so I'm just going to hit the X over here, and then I'm going to hit Save. From here, we now see that my network scan is added to my list, and it will run every week on Thursday at 1 a.m. The reason it says Thursday is because that's today's date when I did it, but the first scheduled time is going to be Saturday at 1 a.m. based on the configuration we did. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how you can update your plugins. To do this, you're going to go and click on Settings at the top, and from Settings, you'll then go down and look at your scanner health. From your scanner health, you'll see the overall health of your scanner. In my case, you can see how much memory is used, what CPU load is currently ongoing, and the hosts that are being scanned, as well as some graphs showing all that information. In addition to that, we can look at the network activity by clicking on the Network tab over here, and that will show us some information about the running scans and the active targets that we're looking at, as well as what sessions are there. If we want to be able to update our scanner, we want to make sure that we check our About area, and this will tell us what version we have, as well as what plugin set and policy template version we're using, as you can see over on the right-hand side. In addition to that, you can see the fact that this was last updated today, and if I wanted to update it again, I would simply click on the little refresh button next to that to see when the last update was, and if you click on Software Update, you'll be able to see if it is configured properly to get all of the updates for the components, for the plugins, or if we disable automatic updates. Personally, I like to use automatic updates, especially when I'm a home user doing this in my home system. If you're in a corporate environment though, do check your policies, because some organizations don't want you to update your components or plugins directly from Nessus, and instead want to use their own custom server, and you can configure that here under the Update server with your custom URL being added in there. Alright, now that we have all that, let's go back to our scans and take a look at some of the things that I've already run so we can see what these scans look like. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at our Windows machines first. Now I mentioned I had two of them done here, one was a credentialed and one was an uncredentialed scan. Let's take a look at our uncredentialed scan first. If I click on my Windows machine, you will see that it has its IP address and we have 10 vulnerabilities that were identified. Those vulnerabilities though aren't really that significant because they're just informational. There are no criticals, no highs, no mediums, and no lows. As you look at the scan details, you can see when it started and when it stopped, and in this case, it took me 6 minutes to scan one machine. In addition to that, you can click on Vulnerabilities, and from here you'll see all 10 vulnerabilities that were found, as well as what their severity is, whether it's info, low, medium, high, or critical, and in my case, they're all informational. In addition to that, you will have a score that's associated with it if it is a critical, high, medium, or low, based on CVSS 3.0 or 3.1, as well as the name of that vulnerability, the family of plugin it came from, and the number of counts. In our case, there's only one count for each because we only scanned one machine. But if I scan my entire network, like the scan that we just set up, that would actually go and look at all the machines on the network, and in my case, there was 5 of them, and if 2 or 3 of those machines had it, we would see that number here under the count. In addition to that, we also have this tab called the VPR Top Threats. Now, this is a proprietary technology used by Tenable, the makers of Nessus, to tell you what is the most vulnerable things. Now, similar to a CVSS score, you can't rely on these solely because this is just Nessus's best guess at what they think is the most vulnerable, but they don't really understand your network as well as you do. For example, they may say that there's a server with a really critical vulnerability that has to be patched, but when you look at that server, it's actually in an isolated subnet that nobody can reach, and therefore, it's not really that vulnerable to attack. And so it may not be as big of a priority as something that's a high or medium that is publicly facing, such as a web server inside of a screen subnet or demilitarized zone. And then the last tab we have is our History tab, and this shows us all the scans that have been made with that profile. In this case, that's my profile of Windows 11 uncredentialed, and you can see here I only scanned one machine one time. If I go back to the Vulnerabilities tab, you can also see that these vulnerabilities, when you click on them, will give you additional information. For example, if I click on the device type, the reason this is informational is because it's saying based on the remote operating system, it's possible to determine what remote system type is, such as a printer, router, general purpose computer, or whatever it is. And we have a 70% confidence level that this is a Windows 11 general purpose machine based on the basic scan that we just did. In addition to all of that, once you have all your vulnerabilities, you don't have to just click through them all here. You can actually do it as a report too. In order to do this, simply click on Report, and then you'll select the type of report you want. Whether you want a complete list of vulnerabilities by host, detailed vulnerabilities by host, detailed vulnerabilities by plugins, or vulnerability operations. Now, when you do detailed vulnerabilities by host, this is what we're seeing here where we have 10 vulnerabilities associated with this single host. But again, if I had 5 or 10 or 500 machines, I might want to look at the vulnerabilities by plugin so I could say which one has the most or which one is the most critical, and then I can see all the machines associated with that. In our case, we're going to do it by host because we only have one host scanned here, and then we'll go ahead and hit generate report here to generate our report as a PDF. You do have 3 options when generating a report. You can do it as an HTML file, a PDF, or a CSV file. In my case, I used a PDF, and you can see that PDF is created right here. And it's a 15-page document with all of the vulnerabilities and what they are and how we can fix them. So as we start scrolling through this, we can see that we have a vulnerabilities by host, and there's only one host. And then if we go down to page 4, we will now see the vulnerabilities. Here, we have 0 critical, 0 high, 0 medium, and 0 low, but we do have 10 informational. We can see when the scan started and stopped. We can see information about that host, and then we start seeing the vulnerabilities themselves. For example, the first vulnerability we have is that Common Platform Enumeration, or CPE, and this says we are able to figure out what type of system it was. And so as we look at that, we can see the output from it, and we can see that it identified us as a Windows host, and that is correct. So that is an informational thing. It's not really a dangerous thing, but if you didn't want people to know you're running a Windows machine, you could do some things to obfuscate that and make it report that it's a Linux machine or a Mac machine or something like that if you wanted to use some kind of security by obscurity technique. Then we can keep scrolling, we'll see the next thing. In our case, we see a device type. And again, we saw this was a general purpose machine. We saw that earlier when we were looking at inside of the Nessus tool. As we continue to go down, you'll see more information of all the things we found. Now here, because these were informational, it's not nearly as helpful as when we find things that have true vulnerabilities, because then it will give us information about the vulnerability and how to solve it. Let me show you what that looks like in just a minute. Right now, let's go back to our scans and take a look at our credentialed scan. Now with the uncredentialed scan, we had 10 things found. Here in the credentialed scan, we do find that we have 11 things. And so we can compare the two, and we can look at one versus the other and see what the difference is and what that one extra thing was. But again, because these are all informational, it's really not that big of a deal. And so we're going to go look at some other scans that may have some better information for us. The next one we're going to look at is going to be our Kali machine. Our Kali machine is actually a very secure machine as well, having 57 informational items and only one low item here as a vulnerability. This scan actually took 16 minutes to complete on this single machine. And when we look at the vulnerabilities, we have 44 of them total. Now, the reason there's 44 is because there's lots of them that have multiple issues, such as HTTP has 3, SSH has 4, SSL has 5, and things like that. When we look at the SSL one, you can see it says mixed, and the reason for that is when I click on this, it works almost like a folder. You can see there was 4 informational and 1 medium vulnerability. This is our first vulnerability that actually has a number or score associated with it. In this case, that's 6.5, giving us a medium classification. If I click on that, we can see the additional information. And in this case, it says the SSL certificate cannot be trusted. And the reason for this, as we look at the output below from the scanner, is that we got information from the system we were scanning, in this case, our Kali Linux machine, and it did have information about the subject and issuer of that digital certificate, but it was a self-signed certificate, and therefore it's being registered as signed by an unknown certificate authority, and that is why this is considered a vulnerability. Now, in my case, because I'm in a lab environment, this isn't really a big vulnerability, and again, it's only a medium level vulnerability, but it is the only vulnerability we have on the system, and that tells me this Kali machine is rather secure. If I wanted to solve this problem, I can then go through and figure out why is this using a self-signed certificate, and how can I get it its own certificate. In this case, it tells me my solution is to purchase or generate a proper SSL certificate for this service, and I can actually go look at those 2 links to see how to do that or get more information about this particular vulnerability. Let's go ahead and go back to our scans. And from here, we're going to go and look at our Mac machine. Now, the Mac machine is a machine I use on a daily basis. And here you can see I have 33 informational and 1 that is a medium vulnerability. Let's see what that one is. As I click on the vulnerabilities tab, I see there are multiple SSL issues, and it's the exact same issue we had on Kali. Now, why is this? Well, on my Mac system, I also have Nessus there. And Nessus is using that same self-signed certificate, again, inside of that installation on my Mac machine, and therefore we're getting the same vulnerability. So I would want to go ahead and install a real certificate instead of using the self-signed one from Nessus to avoid this vulnerability. Next, let's go back to my scans, and from here we're going to look at Ubuntu. Now this Ubuntu one is one that I just installed straight off the CD, and all I did was create a user account and then scan it. So there's no patches that have been done, but you can see that Ubuntu is pretty secure straight from its installation. This is because as part of the installation process, Ubuntu usually will download any new patches and vulnerability updates that it has before finishing the installation, and that's why we're seeing that this is a pretty secure machine. If we look at these vulnerabilities, they're all informational again, and from here you can see it's most of the same stuff. We're getting information about the system, such as its MAC address, its IP protocols being scanned, and things like that. Let's go back to our scans one more time. And from here, you can see that my other two scans are still running, the basic scan of my entire network and the Metasploitable 2 one. Let me go ahead and look at Metasploitable 2 first because this one has a lot of vulnerabilities. Now you'll notice here that I can't export this as a report yet, and the reason is it's still running this scan. I started this scan over an hour ago and we're still at only 99%, but we found a lot of vulnerabilities. Here, even at 99%, we can see 171 informational, 8 lows, 44 mediums, 13 highs, and 15 criticals. This is a really vulnerable system, and if this was on your production network, you would definitely want to start remediating all these issues. So what are some of these issues? Well, let's go ahead and click on our vulnerabilities, and we'll look at the first one we have, which is NFS Exported Share Information Disclosure, and this has a 10.0, which is critical. You can see it's under the RPC or Remote Procedure Call family of plugins, and it happened one time on this system. If I click on it, I can get more information about it. Going down the left, I'll see the description, the solution, and the output we got from the scanner. And on the right, we'll see information about the plugin, such as its ID, the severity, the version, the type, the family, when it was published, and when it was last modified. As you can see, this is a really well-known and old vulnerability from all the way back in 2003, over 20 years ago. In addition to that, we can see risk information, such as what the risk factor is, in this case critical, and the score that it's associated with it, in this case a 10.0 critical under the CVSS version 2 standard. Now, why isn't CVSS version 3 or version 3.1 here? Well, because this is a really old vulnerability from 20 years ago, and they haven't updated it to the latest scoring system, but we still know it's very vulnerable. Then we could see vulnerability information on the right that says things like, is there an exploit available? True, yes there is. That again makes it even more serious for us to patch this vulnerability because not only are we vulnerable, but attackers also know how to exploit it. In addition to that, we can see the ease of that exploit is that exploits are publicly available, and the vulnerability was first known back on January 1st of 1985. So it's really, really old vulnerability here. You can see what you can exploit it with. In this case, you can use Metasploit, and we can see reference information, including the CVEs associated with it, which were all written back in 1999. And you can see that because it says CVE-1999- and then the number for the 3 CVEs associated with this vulnerability. Let's go back to our vulnerabilities again. We'll click on the next one, which is the REXECD service detection. Here we see that that service is running on the host, and it's designed to allow users of the network to execute commands remotely, which could be a bad thing for us as cybersecurity professionals. So to fix it, you would comment out the exec line inside the /etc/inetd.config file and then restart the inetd process. So this one's a pretty easy one to fix. And so we can go in, comment out that line, and then we would be able to restart the process, rescan our system, and verify that this critical vulnerability is no longer there. Let's go ahead and look at our vulnerabilities again. Let's scroll down here and take a look at our bind shell backdoor detection. This one has a 9.8 rating. And again, you can see that this is a shell listening on a remote port without any authentication being required. And this would be a really bad thing because the attacker can use it to connect to the remote port and send commands directly to that system. How do we solve this? Well, we want to verify if the remote host has been compromised and then reinstall the system if necessary. Essentially, we think this is a backdoor or a rootkit of some kind, and this would be a really bad thing. So we would want to be able to fix that. And again, you can see all the details there, including the CVSS scores over on the right-hand side. If we go back to our vulnerabilities, we can look at some other ones, such as our highs, our mediums, or our lows by clicking through all of these. But because there are so many here, what I would probably do is instead, I would run my report, export that as a PDF showing me all the vulnerabilities, including all of the solutions for those vulnerabilities, and then we can pass that over to our system administrators in a prioritized manner, which tells them which things we want them to fix first. And then once they tell us they've done that, we would rescan the system to see if our 95 vulnerabilities now went down to 50 or 40 or 20 or 10 or maybe even 0. But that's probably not going to happen because as you saw, even really secure hosts still have 5 or 10 or 15 of these informational things. And on this system, we have quite a few informational as well, with 57% of our findings being informational. But again, what I'm really worried about is these criticals, these highs, and then even the mediums. The lows don't usually worry me as much, and then the informational don't usually worry me as much either. These are the kind of things you need to look at as you're going through a tool like Nessus. The last one we have is our basic scan of the entire network. Now here you can see that I had 4 machines inside of the scope of this particular scan, and the one that isn't there is Metasploitable because I added that in after the scan started. Now because of that, you can see which machines we have. In this case, the .136 is my Kali Linux machine. The .116 is my Mac system. The .138 is my Windows 11 system, and my .137 is my Ubuntu system. As you can see here, this is what you want your network to look like. This is a nice clean scan. We only have 2 low vulnerabilities, and those low vulnerabilities were basically self-signed certificates for the SSL being run on the Nessus scanner itself. So that tells me these systems aren't that vulnerable to attack, and they're in a pretty good shape. This is what you want your systems to look like by the time you're done doing all your remediation. Unfortunately though, in most production networks, your scans are going to look a lot more like this than they are the one that I just showed you. And the reason for that is sometimes systems are offline when people push patches. Sometimes the systems don't take the patches. Sometimes people say remind me later instead of installing those security patches. And for all those reasons, you start getting vulnerabilities in your system. The nice thing about using a tool like Nessus though, is by going through these and scanning an entire network, you're going to be able to see very quickly which machines you need to focus your efforts on. So if I saw these 4, plus the Metasploitable 2 VM on the screen, I would know immediately that the Metasploitable 2 VM is the one I need to worry about, because it already had so much other things that were critical, high, medium, and low, in addition to the informational. And so that's where my attention would go. That's the idea of using one of these tools to identify what things are on your network that are vulnerable and what things you can do to fix those vulnerabilities.